Now in Plato and Aristotle, who take the soul to be incorporeal, divinity lacks a body. But Stoicism introduces a pantheistic conception of the world according to which God is embodied in the form of fiery breath, acting as the immanent cause of all natural events. As I indicated in those axioms that I mentioned at the very beginning of the handout, Stoics envisioned the life principle or soul as an offshoot of the omnipresent divinity, with the human soul having the potentiality to acquire rationality in its own right, so to speak, from its divine source. Seneca and Epictetus speak of human beings possessing a God within. A famous letter of Seneca's, letter 41, where he says Deus intus, and Epictetus talks similarly, in reference to the intellect, or the governing part. And we can be sure that this was characteristic, I think, of the school. But Marcus uses it far more frequently than any other surviving Stoic author. I guess he was probably encouraged to do so by the related Roman concept of genius, meaning the divine spirit of a family, the gens, that was supposedly inborn in each family member and acted as that person's supernatural guardian. Now in origin, this familial idea of a guardian spirit has nothing to do with divine rationality. But in Marcus's use of the term daimon, I think the traditional Roman notion of a divine aspect of the self has been conflated with the special Stoic notion of one's divine rational essence. And here is a representative selection of passages, under 10. We can read them quickly. It's the mark of the good man to accept and welcome the events and things fated for him, and not to pollute the divinity seated in his chest and disturb it with a throng of impressions, but to watch over it graciously, harmoniously, following God, saying nothing false and doing nothing wrong. Or live with the gods. One lives with the gods if one continually displays one's own soul to them, as content with its dispensations and executing the will of the divinity given by Zeus to each person as guardian and leader, hegemon, playing on that word of course, hegemonikon, and offshoot, apospasma, of himself. This divinity is each person's intellect and reason. And then typical Heraclitean passage in Marcus, the last one here, 217, all the things of the body, a river, of the soul, a dream and delusion. Here's one of the really gloomy bits. A war and foreign residence, posthumous fame, oblivion. Isn't that wonderful? That he's a magnificent writer, of course, Marcus Aurelius, whatever else he is. So what's able to escort us? One thing only, philosophy. That means keeping the internal divinity inviolate and unharmed, mastering pleasures and pains, and doing nothing randomly or falsely or with pretense. Well, we've encountered many of these ideas already. Accepting fate, resisting impressions and sensations, keeping a pure consciousness, integrity of word and deed, and internal security, to counter the instability of everything external to the self. Some things in these passages, however, have come up for the first time in this discussion of ours, such as exhibiting one's soul to the gods. This striking expression, I think, should warn us against treating Marcus's internal divinity as simply a highly charged reference to his mind or reason, though he often does apply these prosaic words to himself. Everybody, of course, agrees that human beings have a mind and some kind of rational capacity. It's hardly normal to think that these properties have anything divine about them, and if they do, what the heck might that mean? In other passages, as we've seen, Marcus identifies himself with his mind as distinct from his body and his life breath. But if his I, or self, I in the sense of ego, was simply identical to his own internal divinity, with no qualification, it would hardly make sense for him to speak of the latter, the divinity, as his guardian, or of his needing to cultivate it and to keep it unharmed. Or if he did, it would make sense, it would be some kind of schizophrenia. Three responses suggest themselves, perhaps, maybe more. First, any concept of selfhood presupposes reflexivity. I'm not two things, an I and a self, being or having a self presupposes an ability to detach one's identity, oneself, from one's subjectivity as thinker or speaker. Hence we're all able, like Marcus, to address, berate and encourage ourselves without becoming bifurcated or schizophrenic. But this elementary linguistic fact is insufficient for our present purposes. Marcus is not writing a diary, as I've said before. He's constantly confronting the I or the you of his present consciousness with an ideal self, that is he or you as he would like them to be, or he as he thinks that they ought to be. This ideal self has much in common with what we might call conscience, a mind that's completely pure and undistracted, perfected rationality, as Stoics would call it. Such an analysis can account for Marcus's treating the ideal self as a guardian. It doesn't do justice, I think, to his full-blown religious language, the divinity seated in his chest, which requires to be kept inviolate. On reflexivity and ideal selfhood takes us into the remarkable cluster of ideas comprised by Stoic pantheism, providence and fate. When Marcus and Epictetus enjoin cultivation of the internal divinity, they're not treating this aspect of selfhood as a unique peculiarity along the lines of Socrates' notorious divine sign, which intermittently told him not to do something he was contemplating. All human beings, according to Marcus, have an intellect that is God, a nous that is theos, an emanation from universal nature, the source of everyone's soul. Epictetus similarly says, you're carrying God around, you poor thing, and you don't know it. The question we need to ask then is how this curious amalgam of psychology and theology relates to Marcus's ethical injunctions to be just and truthful, to cooperate with fellow human beings, while also withdrawing into the private sanctum of a mind sealed off from everything else, including his own natural motions. The passage containing his remarks about everyone's divine intellect surrounds that statement with a series of other reminders. First, do you have this passage? I don't think you do, sorry. If you have a text or translation with you, it was passage 12, paragraph 6, and I just summarise. Sorry, I don't have that in front of you, I think. First, the world's nature is such that everything happening now has always happened and will always happen. Second, human beings are akin to one another, not physiologically, but mentally, which implies that the human community is potentially a community of minds. Third, everything we might deem to be our own property, our children, our body, even our soul, is nature's products. Fourth, everything is what we judge it to be, we've seen that before. Fifth and last, all that anyone ever loses and lives is the present moment, which we've also seen before. Marcus does repeat himself. Now, these propositions I've just rehearsed give Marcus, I think, two complementary perspectives on the self. I'll take this a bit slowly, we're getting in the end. Two complementary perspectives. One of these, which we may call objective, a sort of view from nowhere, to use Nagel's language, seems to reduce individual persons to brief phases in the life of the universe. Because our bodies and our minds are made up of material that's constantly recycled, this is a perspective, this view from nowhere, so to speak, that views ourselves as mere moments in the cosmic flux, endlessly repeatable and ultimately forgettable. Remember how he likes to say, where's Alexander the Great today? Where's Vespasia? All gone. I'll be gone too, he said. But you come back, of course. Under this point of view, an individual mind, far from appearing self-possessed, or something in its own right, is on loan, as it were, from its pantheistic source. We are not the sole and final authors of our thoughts and feelings, since these are ultimately the way the world's universal reason is distributing and particularizing itself. Now, this objective perspective underwrites Marcus's constant refrains concerning be tolerant of other people, be indifferent to suffering, don't be disappointed, expect you're going to die. The essential sameness of everything, the merging of himself in the cosmic whole. That's one perspective. Pascal talks very much like this too. The other perspective is represented in his equally repeated reminder that everything is what the mind judges it to be, with the governing part adapting and making itself whatever it likes, and making every event appear to itself however it likes. And that reads, to my mind, like an acknowledgement of extreme subjectivism, experientially speaking, and in a way of dignifying oneself. The way things appear to us is how they are for us. Marcus doesn't and couldn't mean there are no facts or truths or objective values, but can, and I think does mean, that the world we live in is a world irreducibly mediated by the way we as individuals think and by the concepts, true or false, that shape our individual minds. In other words, we can't get out of ourselves. That's one way to think about these. There's the view from nowhere, as I spoke, reducing ourselves, and that's to a point in flux, and then there's this extreme subjectivism. Another way is to think of these in terms of outer and inner. When Marcus reflects on the course of events, on human history, on the cycle of life from birth to death, he's inclined to view the self and himself in an externalist and deflationary way. But when he focuses inwardly on what he calls, in one passage, 11.1, the properties of the rational soul, its capacity to see itself, articulate itself, and make itself into whatever it wants, he treats his subjective identity as if he himself is the ultimate subject, no mere part of cosmic nature, but fully consonant with it. And whichever way he's speaking, either deflationary or inflationary, as it were, I think he speaks with the voice of his internal divinity. So here we come to my final remarks, and I want now, in conclusion, to address those 2 points of apparent tension that I mentioned at the very beginning of this discussion, the compatibility of fate and autonomy, if they are compatible, and the coherence of the part-whole relation existing between individual human natures and universal nature. Marcus repeatedly insists that his nature as a rational being equips him to be autonomous, meaning never subject to the will or power of anything outside himself. A human hegemonic, he says, has its own authority, cannot be prevented from living according to its inherent irrational nature. But this autonomy, grand though it sounds, has limitations, and they're best explained in his own words, I think, in passage 11. So, passage 8. You should construct your life one action at a time, and be content that each action fulfills itself as far as possible. Very important qualification. No one at all can prevent you from that achievement. That's interesting. How could it, if it's done as far as possible? Some external obstacle will be in your way. Well, none to stop you from acting justly, moderately, and sensibly. Perhaps something else will be prevented from occurring. Well, by contentedly facing that impediment and sensibly adapting to the circumstance, you'll immediately have another action that will fit your life plan. So just like Epictetus, as I mentioned before, Marcus limits unrestricted freedom of action to the internal attitude one can adopt. Thanks to one's God-given rationality, one can adopt towards circumstances, motivations, and moral disposition. Does he take himself in this regard to fall outside nature's causality, the chains of fate? By no means. Passage 12. Bear in mind the whole of substance, in which you participate to a tiny extent, the whole of time, of which a tiny hair's breadth has been assigned to you, and the fate of which you are a minute part. Another person errs? How does that concern me? He'll deal with that. He has his own disposition and activity. I, at this moment, have what universal nature wants me to have, and I do what my own nature wants me to do. Universal nature comprises all particular natures. Its causal sequence governs everything. By comparison, from that objective perspective, the self is a minuscule and pathetically temporary thing. Nonetheless, the self's co-substantiality with universal nature dignifies it hugely by bestowing on it a share of the world's reason, the internal dynamo, and thus a potentially self-determined mentality. Selves that allow their animal nature and unreflective minds to govern their lives abrogate that autonomy. By contrast, a reflective mind's inherence in nature and its understanding of nature give it subjective autonomy. Such a self knows itself to be a minute part of fate, and so an integral part of nature's causal chain. Because that chain determines everything outside the self's reflective powers and rational motivations, a self with Marcus's philosophy recognises both fate and providence in all nature's activities. It would be irrational and impious for such a self to want external events to be otherwise than they turn out to be. By identifying his self with his internal daimon, Marcus, I propose, integrates his subjective identity with his objective participation in nature's causal chain. So under these Stoic perspectives, free will requires determinism, and the free human being requires to see himself as a part of the cosmic universe whole. If it's fully up to you to will what happens as it happens, as Marcus tells himself, you'd better believe in providential determinism. Otherwise, given all the bad things that happen, it would be irrational not to want the world to be different from the way it is. As for part and whole, a non-Stoic might completely reject Marcus's commitment to seeing himself as an integral member of the whole, a citizen of the world. But if you think, as he does, that the possession of reason unites all human beings into a community of selves who are partnered by the omnipresent God or nature, there's nowhere else to go. To be the rational agent that you are, in Marcus's view, requires your cosmopolitan community's participation. So that's my spiel. I tried to show, I think, that the meditations are grounded in the study and practice of Stoicism as we know it to be from all kinds of other sources. But I've convinced myself that their interest goes far beyond these acknowledged antecedents. I mean, I don't know whether I would want to say Marcus is an original theorist, but I do think that the sheer intensity of his inward focus and his genius as a writer, that at least I will contend that he's a genius as a writer, that make the meditations, actually, you can discuss them, I think, in the same breath as you could talk about Augustine or Kierkegaard. You can also, I think, see Marcus as the culmination in our tradition of the Socratic injunction to live an examined life. And there is a little bit of, I think, philosophical history just to conclude with, because, as you probably know, it's a sheer miracle, of course, that the text survives at all. It was not known, of course, in his own immediate afterlife. I think Jerome is the first ancient author to mention it, and then it disappeared, of course, until the 17th century. But once it became available in the 17th century, its influence becomes quite diffuse. The Kantian notion, as you've seen perhaps from some of my terminology, is not the only instance of that, but I do think that Marcus's distinction between his embodied mentality and internal divinity on the one hand, and Kant's distinction between the empirical self and the transcendent ego that you find in the Critique of Pure Reason, the third antinomy, that's not an accidental similarity. And I think you also can find quite a lot of echoes here in Rousseau and even in German Romanticism. In fact, there's a good discussion of this in Charles Taylor's wonderful book, The Sources of the Self, chapters 20 and 21. And I'd like to think also, at least just help me, I think in our modern ways of trying to find appropriate language and concepts for our embodied selfhood, if that's what we have, then I think the meditations can be helpful to us to that. So there I stop.
Thank you.